This is Duke University.
The various genealogical accountings are also tied to the homelands. And if there's political contradictions or conflict between or rivalries, between the homelands, the genealogical accountings are also, in a way, feed into raising a distinction between where you came from and where. So it cannot be that your suffering may be as bad as mine, but where you came from is not as good as where I came from. And you find so that the genealogical accountings are not all positive. And finally, before I move on, genealogical accountings also are multivalent in the sense that they turn inward and outward. The stories that people circulate about procuring documents internal to the community are not the same as what they let out. Often there's a policing mechanism. They just will not tell you because they don't want to divulge the family secrets. So what then happens is that the inside-outside positionality of some of these genealogical accountings is a way of protecting, it's a form of protection, insulation, but at the worst, a kind of enclave building. So this is one of the negative effects of genealogical accountings, is that they also generate the consciousness of an enclave, or they may. Now, if I've mentioned and tried to enumerate all these elements and types and genres, we must also note that the diasporic imaginary, what I'm describing as the diasporic imaginary, is ultimately constituted as a configuration of elements rather than a mere inventory. And I'm going to explain this a bit more. It's a configuration. So all the elements may be in the novel or in the film, but the way they are configured will allow us to say that this is strongly diasporic or not. In fact, I want to further argue that it is best to speak of a spectrum of forms stretching on the one end from the methodological nationalisms of postcolonial literatures to the dialectic of personal and communal integrity and spatial discontinuities of the diasporic imaginaries on the other. Thus, it is fairly easy to assert, and this will not be controversial, that Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a purely postcolonial writer. No one will quarrel with you for saying that. While Eva Hoffman is a diasporic writer, or that G.M. Coetzee's writing is predominantly postcolonial, while Toni Morrison's is inherently diasporic. There will not be any quarrel. Even though some postcolonial writers insist that Toni Morrison is as postcolonial as, and the argument has been made. The problem, however, and the test case for the argument I'm making, is triggered by writings that somehow combine nation and narration to diasporic imaginary, where the decision to be made about where to place them is no longer a straightforward one between postcolonialism and the diaspora. These can be these hybrid, for lack of a better word, hybrid novels have to be analyzed case by case. But I want to argue that the defining question is whether they turn on the narrative mechanisms of a genealogical accounting, as I have said, as I've defined it here. Whether genealogical accounting is a central feature of the text or not, even if they stage nation and narration and diasporic imaginary. And remember always that genealogical accounting is not the same as genealogy. So I was trying to point out earlier. Now let me illustrate this hybridity, this staging of methodological nationalism alongside and almost equally with the diasporic imaginary. The brief and wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, Junot Diaz. By the way, Junot Diaz has a huge female fan club. Women think that he's telling them secrets about the male psyche. He probably is, but it's only the Dominican Republic male psyche. I was telling my students, they were very disappointed. Now, in the brief and wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, the nation and narration element is tied, on the one hand, nation and narration and the diasporic imaginary are both focalized through the family saga of the Cabrals. So both nation and narration and the diaspora are focalized through the family saga of the Cabrals. Also, diasporization is a direct product of the violence of the Dominican Republic as a nation state. But in terms of form, the footnotes, I'm sort of talking as if you've all read it. There are a lot of footnotes which detail a historiography of the Dominican Republic. And it's a historiography of violence, of impunity, or all the bad things. And collectively, they define what he has mentioned earlier, the Fuku Americanis. However, the text itself stages a kind of oscillation between visits to the Dominican Republic and their existence as peripherals in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. But what we find ultimately is that even though this novel, and I can see how someone would say this is actually a post-colonial text, all the insistence on understanding the history, the violent historiography of the DR is post-colonial, is nation and narration. And yet I would hesitate to name it as a post-colonial text because of the repeated insistence in the family saga of the genealogical accounting from what's his name, Abelard, from Abelard the doctor, through Belicia Belli, through Oscar Wilde. There's an reiteration of genealogical accountings. There's a persistent reason. In fact, Belicia's travel to New Jersey is described in terms of going to the airport, boarding the plane, talking to the man next to her. The means of locomotion is even inserted into the way she got to the United States. The other thing that makes it not so easily reducible to a nation and narration, post-colonial text, is the overlay of fantasy. The overlay of fantasy that comes both through Oscar Wilde himself. You know, he styles himself an epic hero of fantasy. He changes the modes at various times, but ultimately he sees himself as an epic hero of fantasy, as a way of relieving him of the banality of his existence as a Dominican man who doesn't manage to get laid. So all his life, he wants to get laid, he's not getting it. So he becomes Gandalf. Now but the curious thing about the fantasy and science fiction is that almost every title that he references is saturated with spatial traversals. And necessarily so, because when you think of fantasy, it is really a movement and spatial traverse, and the conquest of space are central to the fantastic literature. So both these dimensions, I think, prevent us from scaling as it is stating this nation and narration clearly. But these other dimensions make it hard because genealogical accounting is central to the saga of the Cabral family. I'm giving just 3 examples. The second example of a hybrid genre, a hybrid novel, is Amy Tan's Joy Luck Club. Now, Joy Luck Club is an American novel. And yet, the mother's stories of how they got from China, replete with the means of locomotion, escape, and so on. All those details are there, which they tell to their daughters as a means of their educability. That is to say, the stories have an educative value. The mothers are lending these stories to their daughters so that they become proper Chinese American. For the mothers, the emphasis is on the Chinese. So in the Chinese American, in the hyphenated formula, for the mothers, they want their daughters to be Chinese American. For the daughters, they want to be American Chinese. The emphasis on American, not Chinese. What we then see is that the entire novel is a struggle between methodological nationalism of a traumatic China. Most of them, in fact, all four of them leave China under really terrible circumstances of, gender persecution, war, and so on and so forth. But the fact that they insistently remember and remind their daughters of the Chineseness makes that level not easy to ignore. And yet at the same time, the community is the entire novel, Joy Luck Club, is staged in San Francisco. When you reread, and I did this to see what are the social relationships that are defined in the Joy Luck Club, and you find that most of the social encounters and relationships are among the Chinese only. It's a very enclave, in the positive sense, novel. To the degree that, in fact, the Joy Luck Club obliterates America. America does not exist in Joy Luck Club. It is America strictly focalized through the perspective of these Chinese Americans. America actually is set in San Francisco, but all the social relations, when you track who talks to whom and who marries whom and who brings who home, it's all Chinese. The community is very heavily Chinese. But it is Chinese not in China. It is Chinese in America. This also allows us to say that even though it stages an encounter between methodological nationalism of the nation-state form, it is very much a diasporic novel. The final example, which I'm going to talk about more tomorrow, is No Violet Bulawayo's recent We Need New Names. Now, We Need New Names is what I would describe as not just a hybrid text, but a schizophrenic text. Because the first part is set in not a neighborhood, a slum area in Zimbabwe, presumably Bulawayo. And the second part is set in America, in what the author calls, the narrator calls, destroyed Michigan, one word, because that's how she hears it, destroyed Michigan. So she comes to destroyed Michigan. It's a very funny novel. And yet, destroyed Michigan. But there's a loss of dialogical texture. I'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow. There's a loss of dialogical texture between part one and part two, because part one is really narrated around children trying to establish the rules for playing games. But what then happens is that the games that they play become repeated translations of the adult world: AIDS, childhood pregnancy, NGO, the presence, Chinese economic power. Everything is translated through the eyes of play of the children. But in each instance, the children argue among themselves about for example, who is going to play first, who's going to make the first throw, and so on and so forth. Now this dialogical, so it gives the first part of the novel a very fertile dialogical structure, which is lost because the narrator, Darling, travels to destroyed Michigan by herself. So the America that she sees and the community that she gets involved in is an America that becomes more and more monological. Her America is more monological than her depressed childhood. Now this interaction between dialogism and monologism also converts the America into a place of essential alienation. Because America is delivered to her gaze in a series of caricatures, from television, from people that she meets who ask her microaggressive racist questions and so on. So America is a series of caricatures. So what the novel then does is that even though the nation and the methodological nationalist face is a face of extreme poverty, of age, childhood, pregnancy, and so on and so forth. It is an era, it is a domain of greater imaginative possibility. Because the kids, they do have no limit to their imagination. And it's really fascinating to see, because the way they imagine themselves in the world does not correlate, is not commensurate to their poverty, their poor status. They are not limited in their imagination. Whereas in America, there are limitations to the imaginary, a very heavy limitation to the imaginary, such that I would argue that even though this is a hybrid text, and it has a diasporic dimension, it is actually still post-colonial. Because when you think about there's a priority, a creative priority, the potential of the deprived post-colonial is higher than, America is full of food, for example. There's plenitude, but imaginatively it's contracted. So I would say that even though on the surface it seems to be a diasporic text, it's actually post-colonial. So how do we conclude? One of the things that I noticed working on this project, which I'm hoping to become a book someday, is that for the longest time, I even stand accused of this, postcolonial writers considered diaspora a subset of postcolonialism. So it's not uncommon for many, and I don't name names, who to assume that diaspora is just a subset. They are right in a sense, because many postcolonial diasporas, or many diasporas from the third world, were triggered by the fragility of the postcolonial nation state. Whether we think of Nigeria, we think of Ghana, in fact, it's the processes of fragility that triggers there. So it's postcolonial in a sense. However, the attraction of distinguishing diaspora from postcolonialism, even though there are elements of postcolonialism that can be used to illuminate diaspora literature, is that once we agree that there's a distinction to be drawn, we can set up a comparative framework for reading features of the Jewish diaspora, for example, with the Nigerian diaspora. Why not? Because there are many aspects, many things in the Jewish condition, or through that is perceived through their literatures, that are direct reflections of the concerns that we find, say, in this guy, the House of Mr. Biswas. Take a House of Mr. Biswas, for example. There are many things in the House of Mr. Biswas that if you took a Jewish text and paralleled it, you see all kinds of crisscrossing. So there's actually a critical move to be made to break the barriers between these fields. There's actually a very important move to be made to blur the boundary, in fact, break the barriers. Because in fact, the condition of mobility is definitive of the world in which we live today, and has been so since the 1600s. I removed that section. Since the 1600s, the history of the world can be retold through the lens of mobility, as opposed to stable nation-state form from the 16th century down up till now, intensified in our eyes now. The whole history of the world can be retold through the lens of mobilities. Thank you very much.
One of the things I found really interesting are the almost dizzying array of genres and typologies. And I was trying to think about what the significance of the typologies and genres are. One of the things that occurs to me, but I think you probably have a better answer than I would, is that in some ways it demonstrates the coherence or correspondence among the different national and ethnic experiences, social and aesthetic experiences. So for each of your, however minute types, you can find an example from every different ethnic or social experience for it. And in some ways, that I was thinking that maybe the different genres and types, demonstrate that the paralleling of the different experiences.
Each of these types and categories also have to be historicized. Because when you historicize, let's go back to say Rushdie. I've suggested that he's governed by epocality, notions of, but actually when you look at his life, the way he was educated, when he was born, he's a direct product of that epocality. He was formed, and is one of the exemplary figures of that formation. So it's not for nothing. It's almost like his consciousness is overdetermined by the period when he was born, the education that shaped him. So when we will historicize him, we come to see that he cannot but be wedded to that. And he's not the only one. There are other figures in Indian writing who, same with when you switch to Africa, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe. Chinua Achebe was shaped by the epochal making processes of decolonization. That's how they went to school. They always thought about, Gikandi writes a beautiful essay called The Colonial Factor in the Shaping of African Writing. And basically he says that the institutions of colonialism were so ubiquitous, and he names among them the church. The church is actually an institution of colonialism. They're so ubiquitous and so form censuses, the church, schools, universities. They're so ubiquitous that the African writer had to concern him or herself with the colonial template all the time. They were products, direct products of, so the typology, one is, as I said, it allows us to see in the minutiae of, okay, we can see this genre, performed here, and we can also see it there. But actually, when you separate them and historicize them, they may reveal slightly different genealogies, or the etiology of this particular, train, or this particular reflection on locomotion in an Indian writer. And the reasons may be different when we think about it historically. So this is just a way of proliferating minutiae that we then have to historicize as a way of doing proper comparative. So the comparison cannot be done without historicization.
Is there a genre in dealing with post-colonial literature? Is there a genre that can be seen as anti-neo-colonial, as we look at, or de-neo-colonial, as we look at decolonial literature, and how does this affect our understandings of the shapings of post-colonial literature or post-colonial theory by bringing in certain tangibles? I'm thinking about Libya. You mentioned Chinatown. Chinatown's in Africa now.
Yeah, big ones.
And so I was wondering.
Okay, now there's been a debate in postcolonial studies similar to what you're saying that we are not. But see, there are two things. One is that post-colonial with a hyphen is temporal. It's a temporal marker. So before they were colonized, and then after a certain day they were post-hyphen colonized. In the field, post-colonialism without a hyphen, it has nothing to do with temporality. It's an orientation to discourses and forms. Now, most post-colonial scholars emphasize the second as opposed to the first. That is to say, so when I speak of post-colonialism, I can see elements of post-colonialism in the heart of empire before decolonization, 19th century, 18th century. Yes, I was talking about the history of, you were here, the history of trade, merchant relations on the west coast of Africa. There are many post-colonial unhyphenated elements. So that's one point. So the distinction has to be made. Normally when it's, and sometimes I explain it by saying that anyone that thinks that the term post-colonial is necessarily a temporal marker is committing the same category mistake as saying that because Wordsworth was a romantic poet, he must have known a lot about love. He has no relation. He's a romantic poet, but did he actually write any love poems? Probably not. So it's the same thing. However, the second point about neo-colonialism must be well taken. Now, in fact, there still are strong writers of the neo-colonial or who always query. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a good example. He has gone as far as saying that to write in any language other than your traditional language is to have capitulated to neo-colonialism. He says that. He has a famous essay, The Shackles of the Mind. You've been freed. You've been decolonized, but your mind is still shackled, in the sense that you want to send your schools to the best schools in America or Britain. You want to ride in the best cars, all imported, and so on and so forth. But most people also say that neo-colonialism is better understood. So neo-colonialism is really a subterfuge. It's a diversion, it's a red herring, because what we should really be worried about is capitalism. Capitalism is the real trouble, because the objective of capitalism, so I mentioned earlier that one defining things about a diaspora is the relation between integrity and spatial discontinuity. Some might argue that you don't need to move to experience space discontinuously, because capitalism doesn't want you to feel at peace wherever you are. Its objective is to feel that wherever you are still devoid of completion. You cannot complete yourself without devouring objects, which only capitalism will make available to you. So that some will argue that neo-colonialism is best understood unmasked. And the unmasking, once we unmask neo-colonialism, the real trouble is capitalism. So there are people, but most people in the field, as far as I can tell, are more interested in the maraudings and the violences of capitalism as opposed to neo-colonialism. So the term neo-colonialism is not, correct me if I'm wrong, is not so popular, whereas there are many critiques of capital and globalization and global capital and so on.
I wonder if you could think a little bit about where vernacularity fits, differentiate within this account of post-colonial and this account of diasporic. I mean, I think you would predict that some agonistic relationship to writing in a world language rather than an autochthonous language. Obviously, autochthonous language become more languages, vulgar languages, or some point but that agony would seem to be more on the post-colonial side than the diasporic.
In much diasporic writing, and by writing I don't mean just literature, thinking through, the mastery of many languages is fundamental to being that. The Jews are the best example. Historically, there's a beautiful essay by a guy called John Armstrong titled Proletarian and Mobilized Diasporas. And basically he says, and this has become a classic in the field, how Jews, and he traces it from the Middle Ages, whether they liked it or not, they had to master the many languages of wherever they were. The Venice of the 15th to 17th centuries. So they became, for example, typically they became translators. They became traders, but they also became translators. So in the diaspora, the objective is to master as many tongues as you can, because in the diaspora, language is considered purely of instrumental value. You need to master it in order to get by. And many diasporics will say, don't forget your own language, fundamentally. Don't forget Chinese, don't forget Akan, whatever it is, but master English, master French. Speak French or Spanish or English better than the native. This woman, Eva Hoffman, in her memoir, Lost in Translation, she says, the foreigner is, I have to remember properly, the foreigner is an intensified copy of the native. The foreigner is an intensified copy of the native. But the foreigner is under obligation, it's not a choice. Whereas in the nation, in the post-colonial nation, the anxiety is precisely about the loss of the native tongue. That somehow colonialism, and this is actually a serious problem all across Africa, that there's a generation of children who, I have to report a joke, what a Nigerian friend of mine tells me. He comes from Port Harcourt. So he's in the States, he goes to Port Harcourt, and he runs into a woman friend of his from school. They went to school together. She's walking with her 7-year-old son. So they chat a little bit in Igbo, and they speak Igbo, and then he turns to the little boy and asks him in Igbo, "What is your name, young man?" The mother doesn't allow the son to reply. When she tells him, "Oh, As for him, he doesn't speak Iba. Iba means malaria. He doesn't speak malaria. Oh, as for him, he doesn't speak Iba. She doesn't even want to use the word Igbo. It's too heavy for her. There is actually a generation of Africans, and I know Africa best, where the idea that your native tongue is the authentic, which was predominant in the Achebe, Soyinka phase, is loosening up. What Ngugi fears most is actually already upon us. So the anxieties about language loss in the post-colony, whereas for the diaspora is the opposite. The more languages you master, the better it is for you. Translation, I mean, the many languages actually evolved because of a commitment to translation. Spain is a good example. The golden era Spain. I forget the name of the king, but he decided, the monarch, he decided that let us translate all the classics of Europe into Spanish. And that broke the boundary, it expanded the boundaries of Spanish. So that actually reading text in translation is a way of supporting the process of the expansion of languages. It doesn't kill language, it's the opposite. So for example, my ideal scenario would be that all the classic texts of the Western tradition will be translated into Akan. So Das Kapital, whatever Don Quixote, translate into Akan, because it forces the language to adjust, to accommodate, to hybridize in a way. So I would take the opposite view, that in fact, reading works in translation is a commitment to expanding languages. Except, of course, that now the translations are mainly from European to European. There are very few texts that are translated. I mean, Achebe has been translated in how many? 38 languages. So we assume that there's a Zulu version of Things Fall Apart. But it's not many texts that have many languages that have that. And of course, translation also requires resources. So we must also understand. So I would, you know, I would take a slightly different view.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.